The seeds of conflict would be sown through heightened polarization and societal fragmentation, with key indicators including widespread distrust, loss of faith in government institutions, elections, and law enforcement, militia and extremist activity, increased activity and organization of armed groups on both sides of the political spectrum, localized violence, escalating political violence, including protests turning into riots or armed clashes, state versus federal tensions, states opposing federal mandates, potentially defying federal authority, such as sanctuary laws or bans. A triggering event. A second civil war would likely start with a high-profile incident that exacerbates tensions. Possible triggers might include disputed elections, allegations of widespread voter fraud, or refusal to accept election results, leading to mass protests and localized armed conflicts. Federal overreach or resistance. Federal actions such as gun confiscation or enforcement of controversial laws could spark rebellion in certain states or regions. Economic collapse. A severe economic downturn could destabilize society, leading to unrest over food, housing, and other essentials. Localized secession attempts. States or regions with strong independence movements, like Texas or California, might try to secede, prompting federal military intervention. Number 3, decentralized conflict. Unlike the first Civil War, a second one would likely be highly decentralized, resembling an insurgency or low-intensity conflict. Guerrilla warfare. Armed groups would likely engage in ambushes, sabotage, and asymmetric tactics rather than conventional battles. Urban versus rural divide. Conflict could center on ideological divides between urban and rural areas, with urban centers controlled by federal forces and rural areas harboring insurgents. Fragmentation. Rather than a clear north versus south divide, conflict zones might form around ideological enclaves or contested regions. Number 4, the role of technology. Modern technology would shape the conflict. Social media as a catalyst. Social media would be used for organizing propaganda and spreading misinformation, escalating tensions. Cyber warfare. Attacks on infrastructure, such as power grids, financial systems, and communication networks, could paralyze regions. Drones and surveillance. Widespread use of drones for reconnaissance and attacks would redefine warfare tactics. Federal and state responses. The government's response would depend on the scale of the unrest. Federal crackdowns. Deployment of federal law enforcement and National Guard to quell unrest. State defiance. Some states might refuse federal orders or even support insurgent groups, furthering divisions. Martial law. In extreme cases, martial law could be declared in affected regions, leading to curfews, checkpoints, and suspension of civil liberties. Economic and social collapse. As the conflict spreads, the strain on resources and infrastructure could lead to broader societal collapse. Disrupted supply chains. Shortages of food, fuel, and medicine due to blockades or sabotage. Mass displacement. Millions of civilians might flee conflict zones, creating refugee crisis. Breakdown of governance. Local governments might collapse in contested areas, leading to lawlessness. Escalation to larger conflict. Outside interference. The conflict could escalate through outside interference. Foreign nations might provide support to factions to advance their geopolitical interests. Fragmentation of the U.S. military. If ideological divides infiltrate the military, factions could split and engage in combat. Secession movements. Entire regions or states might formally declare independence, triggering large-scale conflict. What it could look like initially. Weeks 1 through 4, a triggering event sparks nationwide protests, riots, and sporadic violence. Armed groups take control of small towns or neighborhoods. Months 1 through 3, federal forces and state militias engage in localized skirmishes. Infrastructure begins to fail in contested zones. Refugee flows increase as civilians flee hotspots. Months 3 through 12, conflict escalates into a patchwork of insurgencies and counterinsurgencies. Major cities are fortified, while rural areas become conflict zones.